All right, so what we're going to do now is shift away from just individual organisms and classification to ecology. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. You would really be taking a whole course in ecology and potentially multiple courses in ecology, pursuing a biology degree. But at the end of the organismal course, we're going to kind of bring it back to really, in a way, to the beginning. We start off with some things with genetics and then population genetics, talking about populations and then how those mechanisms, drive evolution and diversity. And then we went through diversity of organisms and kind of a tour through all these different animals. And now we're going to kind of come back around to the populations and look at some of the things that are studied when people do study organisms within a population. But a little bit more than that, we're going to study a little bit about just ecology in general. Okay, so when we study ecology, we're studying really the organisms and the environment. And it could be a variety of different things, how organisms are interacting with other organisms, how organisms interact with the environment, and really a combination of all those things. Some aspects of ecology are more biochemical, looking at nutrient and energy flows between communities or ecosystems, populations, or planetary, global systems. So what we're going to do is just really focus on some terms and just some basic concepts and some of the ways in which populations are studied to start with, and then we'll look a little bit. And so we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about communities and ecosystems, not in this particular lecture, but that'll be the series that we'll go through. So we'll talk about what's a population. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species who are in the same place at the same time. And that place, is then going to be, defined by a number of, maybe potentially geographic barriers, things that separate maybe one, say, population from another, like a river, one around one side and the other, and they don't cross the river, or a mountain range, or just habitats, which we'll get a little bit in the end, but that's really more just the environment itself. But that's kind of what we'll talk about as we go into like the communities and ecosystems more so. And so what are those? So community ecology is where we have populations of different species and their interactions. So living in the same area, again, at the same place at the same time, there'll be different species. Some of them will be eating others. So it could be animals and plants. It could be different plants competing with each other for space, for light, and nutrients and water. It could be, animals competing with other animals. They're predator and prey animals, or their animals are competing for habitat and space, for dens or places to sleep or raise their young. So there's all these different sorts of interactions between organisms living together within the same community. So that's a study of community ecology, which is something we'll go into next. And then there's ecosystems ecology, which are really, the populations and the communities interacting with the environment. Okay, so the difference between, so that's ecosystems. So populations are just focusing on one species of organisms. Communities are where we're looking at different species and them interacting with each other. So organisms interacting with other organisms. And as we get to ecosystems, that's where we're looking at the organisms interacting with different aspects of the environment. Now, the thing is, the environment's going to be involved in all these things to some degree, but that's not necessarily the focus of the study in the other areas of ecology. So if you say you're a population ecologist, you're typically studying the organisms of a particular species, populations of those species. But aspects of their environment, like water availability, or the nature of the soil, how the rock and the certain habitats are going to affect that population. And that's kind of what we're going to get into now, like, so the things that people study. So that's kind of how these things are going to differ a bit. So what is it that people study when they study populations? Well, major aspects of population studies are demography, M, which has to do with population densities and population distributions. So how many individuals in the population, how many individuals per sort of area, of the population, per square meter or square mile, that sort of thing. How are they distributed within that area? And that's and then what are the factors that are affecting those? Or is it interactions among themselves, interactions with other organisms? Are there environmental aspects that are kind of regulating or controlling this or affecting, how they are distributed, and so on. And so those are the things that we're going to kind of talk about right now, defining some other terms. So one of the things that we look at when we're studying populations, we said, are distributions. Distributions are usually sampled in the environment, not by looking at every aspect of the whole population, but usually sampled in the field using a quadrant method. So if you were to have a large area, what you would do is take a little square quadrant, and depending on the size of the area, it might be bigger or smaller. And then within that area, one, you may count, how many individuals are in that area. And the other thing you may do is then measure the distance between each of the individuals. So one individual to the next, a sort of nearest neighbor type of measurement. So how close are you to one another? And in doing that, so you take a whole bunch of these. Usually there's a way of assigning it to be very random as opposed to haphazard. And you look at all these little areas. And in each of these different areas, you find individuals of the species you're interested in, of that particular population. And then you're counting them. You might be doing a whole bunch of other things, like we'll talk about later. Like you're measuring them, you're weighing them, you're maybe taking samples from them. So a whole variety of different things might be done. And that's kind of where we start, with what we're going to talk about. So there's field sampling that would first take place, and then we might look at the distribution, for example. So distributions of organisms might be very uniform, like this. Meaning that once you start to measure, how far is this plant away from another plant of the same species, and you find, it's so many inches or so many meters, away, and then you do that individual to another individual, that individual to another individual, and generally you find that they're very even, in terms of their distribution. So that's called a uniform distribution, and we'll talk a little bit about why, in a second. We'll just describe them first. We have organisms that are in a very random distribution. So we'll find some organisms here, some or other areas where there are no organisms of that particular species, no individuals. Sometimes we'll find a bunch of individuals together. Sometimes we'll find individuals all by themselves. So here these are very close together. These are far away from one another. So there's no particular pattern that's consistent. We're finding all sorts of different types of things, which again is probably due to the environment. And then we're going to find a clumped distribution, where we tend to find individuals all together in one area, and then no individuals, and then again individuals together in another area. So what are the factors that will affect this? Well, and there are a number. There's some of the factors that affect this are it's affected by. So one is just the environment itself. Let's say these are plants, maybe in this particular example. So they live in a particular type of soil. Some of the areas might be a mixture of soil and rock. So the plants aren't going to grow in the rock, but the rock still makes up a certain amount of that area that you're sampling, and so you don't find them there, but you find them together, right? So for example, soil, could affect it. Moisture. So these are things that we're going to refer to as abiotic factors. So nutrients in the environment, chemical conditions, other aspects, that maybe there's a slope of a hillside, and the way the light hits it, some areas get more light during the day than other areas. So the plants maybe tend to live or grow better in the areas where there's more light versus areas where there's not. Again, that's an abiotic factor. It's the availability of light. So those sorts of things can affect it. There are also biotic factors. One of these might be competition. So individuals need nutrients, they need water, and they need space in order to grow. So if they tend to be clustered together, maybe then they're competing with one another, and a dominant individual that can grow a little bit better will overgrow the others, shade them out. Maybe the others won't get as much sun. That competition might kill some of them off in certain areas. So we can kind of see that kind of happening in some particular cases. In addition to that, other biotic factors could include reproduction. So let's say it's not a plant, and let's say these things are some animal, right? And they're a marine animal like a barnacle. So barnacles, for fertilization, they actually copulate to fertilize. Some other marine invertebrates broadcast spawn, so they release the gametes into the environment. So if you're a broadcast spawner, as long as you're in the same area as other individuals, the fertilization occurs in the water column, so you don't have to be like right next to each other. You can be spaced apart. So often for other reasons, for say just feeding and filter feeding out of the water, you might be a little more spread out, in terms of distribution, but not too far apart so that the gametes can't mix. If you're a type of organism who has to mate with another individual in order to be successful, then you have to be close together. So then you might find clump distributions where all the individuals are clumped together in patterns, then some areas where you don't find any, then another area where you find a big clump pattern of them because they need to be close to their partners for reproduction, or the reproduction won't be successful. So this is things that people might say for years and trying to figure out and look at a variety of different factors. But one of the first things you might determine is, what is their distribution? How do we describe it in terms of this case? So this is what we're just doing here, is looking at just the basics of describing the distribution of an organism. And again, for this, we would be looking at just one species, one species of barnacle or one species of plant. And then later, to try to explain their distribution, we might start to look at other species, which is then we're starting to then look at a community. But if we're just focusing on population ecology, we're just focused on that one particular species. Now, in addition to that, people may start to then measure. As I said, once you're sampling the environment, you might start to measure the size of the individual. So you might look at the age of the individuals. So age, and so we'll look down here, and survival. So if we look at ages of individuals in the population, we'll get an idea of how easy it is for them to survive throughout their life. Is it difficult? Do they pretty much all survive for a very long time and then die off? Do they die off quickly, as young, or do they just kind of randomly die off throughout their life, and there's no one set particular reason why that happens, or particular pattern to it? So we have these three curves here, which are very general. Not all organisms will fit the curve, and either any of these curves, and some organisms will kind of fit both of them at different times, depending on their age. So what we're looking at here are the percent of lifespan. So that's kind of 100% of the lifespan. That's kind of where all individuals die. And down here is the beginning of the lifespan. So this is kind of representing birth, and this is representing final death of all individuals in the population in terms of age, they don't really get past a particular age. And so there's no age set here because all different organisms are different. Some organisms live only a year. That's their whole lifespan. They never get older than 1 year. Other organisms can live hundreds of years. And so we're just giving it sort of a percent of what that lifespan would be for anything. A mushroom, an insect, a mammal, a fish, whatever it happens to be. You can see this is not an even distribution here. It's more of a logarithmic type distribution in terms of the way the numbers are. So 10, 100, 1,000. And what we're looking at here are these different patterns. So we have a type 1 pattern, a type 2 pattern, and a type 3 pattern. So these are the curves. So in the type 1, what we see are that individuals in that population, so it's this one with the pink line here, when they're young, after birth, they tend to survive. And they tend to survive, and then, over time, as lifespan goes on, there's sort of this constant death rate, but it's slow. But once they reach a particular age, the death rate becomes very high, right? And so usually most individuals don't make it past a certain point. Versus, say, type 3, which is sort of the opposite end of it, where we see something different, very different. We see right after birth, most individuals die. They don't survive very long. But if you make it to a certain age, then it kind of levels off. Then you're pretty good for a long time, and then slowly over time, then individuals die and they don't make it past a particular age. There's also another pattern, which is that age really doesn't matter. So young individuals or older individuals have pretty much the same chance of dying because there are other sorts of factors that are affecting, whether they're going to die or not. So here we see, often there's a lot of potential protection for the young, or the young are very well adapted, to their environment right from the start. Right? So you can see the birth in some mammals very shortly after they're born. Not humans, obviously, but some of them can, within minutes even, get up and run, and escape from a predator. I watched a video where, this animal was just born, there was a predator around it, and minutes after it was born, it was under attack and being chased down and running away. So some individuals, shortly after birth, already have the ability to move and escape from predators. Other individuals require a huge amount of care, and so they might both be included in here. So some may have to, the parents are then fighting off the predators, and they're keeping the individuals safe when they're young, and once they make it past that age, then they're adapted to do so on their own. Here what we see are usually, in the type 3 here, these are a lot of the invertebrates. Have this type of strategy. And what we see is that, as well as individuals who have the type 1 pattern tend to have fewer offspring because they tend to require more care and protection in order for them to survive. Whereas in this type 3 here, we see organisms have hundreds of offspring, thousands of offspring in one reproductive event. And most of them are going to just die off. They're not going to survive. They're not going to survive through metamorphosis, even many of them. But then the ones that do survive to that past metamorphosis, and then they become juveniles, then they're set. For a long time, they're good, and they can feed, and they can protect themselves, and they're fine on their own. Birds, a lot of songbirds follow this pattern, where age doesn't matter. It's kind of like, well, they're cared for when they're young, but some of the chicks die, some of the eggs don't hatch, some of the eggs are consumed, so there's some death rate there, but there's sort of a mixture of sort of the numbers that are born versus the way that they're protected. But then once they mature, they're dying through other reasons. A predator is going to eat an older bird or a 1-year-old younger bird. Equally, maybe the older bird is more aware of the predator because of its behavioral interactions, but generally their death rates, by accidental death rates or through predation, are about the same regardless, of the age. So that's another sort of pattern that we see. And then some organisms like shift around and display different patterns, but those are the three kind of primary types of survival patterns we see within populations of individuals, and that's usually used to describe them. So what we're doing is then say you find individuals in a population, you're counting them, you might be measuring them, and sometimes the size indicates their age. Other ways, techniques might be needed to then age an organism than just measuring them or weighing them. So when we then look at a population and we look at sort of distributions, by age, we find that there's often these three major patterns that we find. We find populations that are increasing, populations that are stable, and populations that seem to be decreasing. And so organisms within the population by age, instead of just giving them a year, they're usually put into one of three categories. So usually they're either pre-reproductive, so young, they're just born, they're starting to mature, they're juveniles, they're not reproductive yet. Then they reach a reproductive age, so then we have all the reproductive individuals of the population. And then for a number of organisms, they reach a post-reproductive age. Which could be based on a number of factors. It could be on some organisms that are social. It could be a social reason why they're post-reproductive. They could biologically be capable of reproduction, but in those communities and populations or species, they don't. And others lose the ability after a certain point in time, and they're incapable of reproducing, but they don't die. Organisms then tend to have different types of strategies in terms of whether they reproduce more than once in their life or only once. So we call this semiparity, which is 1x, one time. So there's some species that they mature to reproductive age, they reproduce once, and that's it. And some of them die. So there are a number of insects that follow this particular pattern where they live most of their life as an aquatic nymph. We talked a little bit about this back when we looked at arthropods. That the aquatic life cycle of a number of different terrestrial insects, they have gills, they respire in the water, they're a little aquatic organism, they're an insect, and then they undergo a metamorphosis, and then they become a type of fly, say like a mayfly. They are set to reproduce, and that's pretty much it. There are some of those insects who don't even have mouth parts to feed. They are their purpose is to reproduce, lay eggs, and then die. And that's it. They don't really live in that life form very long. So once they reach reproductive maturity, that's all for them. So that's a consideration. There's also heteroparity, which is many. So these are individual species who, as a species, individuals in those populations, they reach a reproductive age and they can reproduce 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, many times. It just depends on the organism, but they can reproduce many times through their reproductive span. So how do we describe those if we're looking at then the populations? So we might then start to age them, see the numbers of individuals in a population, and we might find there's a population that has a lot of young in the population, and that's the biggest group. They're all pre-reproductive. So that's an example of an increasing population. This population is having a very high reproductive output at this point in time. And so that means the population is going to grow. It's going to continue to grow over time. And that's one that we would see then the numbers over time. The prediction would be that they're going to go up. And we'll talk about the word I just mentioned, prediction, in a second, in terms of how we study ecology and sort of predict and model systems. In other groups, what we might find is that the number of pre-reproductive individuals and reproductive individuals might be very similar, to one another. And even the post-reproductive individuals, they start to get fewer of them because they start to die off, but it's not that dramatic. And so what we start to see is that's an example of just a fairly stable population. I mean, the numbers may rise a little, they may drop a little from time to time, but overall we wouldn't expect in that population the numbers to change much unless something happens. Something happens to their environment, or one of their resources disappears, or some new organism is introduced. That may either kill them off, or it may trigger them to change their strategy in some way. If we look at a population and we find very few pre-reproductive individuals, very few young, and there are a lot more of the kind of reproductive and even post-reproductive individuals than the pre-reproductive. So the young individuals, that means that's a population that is potentially dying out. So the individuals are stopping to reproduce, which might be because they've run out of a resource. They don't have enough food to reproduce maybe as much as they used to, so individuals can't invest as much in reproduction, and so they're dying off, or something else has changed, or a new predator again is like eating all the young. The older ones can escape, but the younger ones can't, and they can't protect them, and so eventually that population is going to maybe disappear, at least from that area locally. So those are the sorts of patterns. And so I color code them here, with the pre-reproductives being the blue down the bottom, the reproductive groups kind of being here in the pink, and then the older post-reproductive individuals being in that green. So that's kind of this first part of looking at populations, and a couple different figures that are very commonly looked at when we study the terminology and the techniques of studying populations. A lot of what is done is first looking at what we see in the environment and then creating models. So I mentioned that a lot of it's about prediction as far as what is going to happen. Like I said, if you just sampled at a point in time and this was your distribution, your prediction is that's a population that is likely going to increase. It may not. There might be other things that you're unaware of that then if you monitor it over time, you realize, oh, there's something else happening I didn't account for, and you'd have to change that model and include other information. The thing about studying ecology is that it's usually not a very quick thing to do. It takes a very long time. It takes often years of field work and data to be collected to really get a sense or picture. Just little snapshots of what's going on at any moment in time are not necessarily great predictions of what has happened or what's going to happen in the future, because things can change a lot, and some organisms are extremely adaptive to the environment. So they may adapt to that change within a few years and then sort of rebound, to some sort of stress. So that's the first thing. Just make sure you kind of know the basic terms for how to describe individuals' distribution of population as either being clumped, random, or uniform. Survival curves that in some populations of species, they survive pretty well from the young ages, and then they decrease as they get older. Others mostly die off when they're young because they can't survive and they're eaten by predators. And some, there's kind of an equal rate. So we're going to continue talking about populations, and then we're going to describe some other terms and some other ways of studying different types of reproductive strategies that organisms have that kind of will fit in actually with both of these figures